Last time that we were talking about colonialism, we talked about how the Europeans were starting to come over to Africa. And the reason why they could do that is because they had a couple of different advances, both in medicine as in some technological advances in developing the steam engine. And we talked about how this was driven mainly by ethnocentric point of view. That's a belief that you are superior to everybody else who's not of your ethnic group. So basically, if you're not British, you suck. And that was kind of the belief there, right? So that's an example of ethnocentrism. And the reason why they were kind of pushing to Africa was they were looking for cheap raw materials. So that was kind of one of the main things, looking for these cheap raw materials that they can then send back to Europe. Gotta make a new bullet, and we're gonna write down the Congo sparks interest. So bullet, Congo sparks interest. So the Congo starts to spark interest. What ends up happening is there's a guy, he's named David Livingstone. All right. And David Livingstone, he's a minister from Scotland. You don't need to write this down right now. I'm just kind of talking about stuff. But David Livingstone, he's a minister from Scotland, and he decides he's going to go look for the source of the Nile. So he's like, hey, where does the Nile River start at? So Nile River, it's over here in Africa, kind of runs down for this area here. And David Livingstone wanted to figure out where it started at. So he was exploring into the interior parts of Africa to figure out, hey, where's the source of the Nile? And he was also very much against slavery as well, which he ends up talking about as well in his writings. But he's kind of exploring through the Congo area, and he's gone for a long time. And he's been gone for so long that a newspaper hires a reporter, Henry Stanley, to go find Livingstone. So Henry Stanley is hired by this newspaper to go find where David Livingstone was and to write about his story and so forth. So Stanley then goes to Africa to go looking for Livingstone. And while Stanley's in Africa, of course, he meets various tribes and so forth and ends up kind of communicating with them and such. And eventually he finds Dr. Livingstone. And he has a famous line when he meets Dr. Livingstone. He says, Dr. Livingstone, I presume. So that's a famous quote from Henry Stanley. And after he meets Livingstone, there's somebody else that took interest in Henry Stanley. So Henry Stanley, meets Livingstone, finds him, and then he writes a story about Livingstone and Livingstone's adventures in Africa. So after he wrote about all that stuff, his paper became kind of famous that he wrote. King Leopold II took interest in the story as well. Now, he was a king of Belgium, and he was like, man, this is an interesting story. But he wasn't interested in Livingstone going to Africa and visiting there. What he was interested in was Henry Stanley and Henry Stanley's communication that he had with all these various tribes. So he ends up getting Henry Stanley to come back to Africa, back to the Congo area where Stanley had gone through to look for Livingstone, had him go back to the Congo and had all these tribes sign various paperwork and treaties that they didn't understand what the heck they were signing. And then those paperwork were given to King Leopold II, which gave him control over all those territories. Go ahead and make a 1. We're going to write down treaties negotiated by Stanley gave King Leopold II of Belgium personal control of these lands. And there's King Leopold II up there in the top picture. Kind of looks like evil Santa Claus. So this basically gave King Leopold II control over all this territory in Africa. And with control of all those territories in Africa, King Leopold II then started to move his troops in the area, and then he starts to have people do forced labor. So not quite slavery. He's like, oh, they're not enslaved. I'm just forcing them to work for me on these rubber plantations. So so he was setting up all these rubber plantations in the Congo. He was forcing people to work on the plantations. There was a lot of taxes that the people had to pay. The Africans that were working on the land had to pay. Quite a lot of abuses as well. And there was also a food problem because the soil in the Congo isn't great. And then they started doing all this intensive rubber tree farming. And since the soil wasn't great, it sucked up nutrients from the soil that could have been used for farming food. So that caused other issues as well. And yeah, and also turning a lot of the farmlands from food production into rubber tree sap production also meant there was less, food being produced. All right. New bullet. Motives driving imperialism. So bullet, motives driving imperialism. So what ends up happening here is as soon as the Congo is taken over by Belgium, once again, King Leopold II, King of Belgium, when he takes over the Congo right here and he gains control of all that territory, everybody else, France, Germany, Britain, Italy, Portugal, Spain, bam, they all start rushing in and start just gobbling up pieces of Africa as well. Go ahead and make a 1, and we're going to write down imperialism and then equal sign. So 1, imperialism, equal sign. So imperialism, we've talked about before, but it's the takeover of a country or territory by a stronger nation. Just go ahead and write down that part of the definition. So imperialism equals sign, takeover of a country or territory by a stronger nation. So in imperialism, when a nation takes over the territory of another nation, that's weaker, and they do so with the intent of dominating or controlling the political, that's the government, economic, that's the way how people, work in their jobs, and the social life of the people of that nation. So they basically come into an area and they take over control of every aspect of the people's lives of that nation. And those people in that nation have no say in what's going on. They're simply the will of the stronger nation is enforced on the weaker nation. And so that's kind of imperialism. So who are our nations that are being imperialistic? Well, let's write down these nations that are being imperialistic. We're going to make it 2. We're going to write down Belgium, France, Germany, Great Britain, Italy, Portugal, and Spain. So 2, Belgium, France, Germany, Great Britain, Italy, Portugal, and Spain. So those nations are kind of the main nations that were enforcing their will into the area. And you can see over in the map on the right-hand side which territories each one of those nations controlled. With Britain having the biggest amount of territory, followed by France then having the next biggest amount of territory in the area. All right. So why was it that the Europeans were able to go into the area? Why were they able to dominate the Africans and take over the entire continent and have control over it? So what was the reason for that? Well, there was a couple of technological advances that made it so that they could easily dominate into the area. Go ahead and make a bullet and write down forces enabling imperialism. So bullet, forces enabling imperialism. Now, we talked about how there was medical advances as well as steamships. Those are both pretty important. One of the most important things, though, was also an invention of the Maxim gun. I'm going to make a 1 and write down Maxim gun. Maxim gun is in the picture here on the left-hand side and in the center. And you can also see in our picture the Maxim gun right here on the right-hand picture. Maxim gun was the first machine gun that actually worked well. A key word there is worked well. There were other machine guns made that didn't work very well. So this machine gun actually worked pretty well. You could set it up. You could then spray it at the enemy. And the machine gun made wars very defensive because if you're trying to charge at the enemy and you just get mowed down by machine gun fire, well, you can't really charge at them. So all the enemy has to do, or in this case, the Europeans, is set up in a defensive position, wait for the enemy to try and attack them, and then just mow them down with machine gun fire. Which is pretty much what they did to any of the Africans when they tried to rebel. It's just that once the Europeans had a foothold somewhere, they could defend it and just hold on to that territory pretty much indefinitely as long as they had machine guns that they could cover themselves with. The only times that the Africans were really successful against Europeans is when they're able to pull them out of a defensive position and engage them in an open area and surround and destroy a smaller force. That's when they were able to be successful. But as soon as the Europeans were able to have a defensive position and hold it. They just could not break through it. So the Maxim gun helped out to make wars very defensive. So you didn't really have very many offensive wars after this point in time when the Maxim gun is brought in. Wars became very defensive. That's why in World War I, you see all these trenches and everything, and the military lines, military combat lines don't really change a whole lot. It's a very defensive war, and you build trenches and you hold your little area, which is turned in World War II because once you get the tank coming around, the tank, doesn't care about machine gun fire because it's tank the bullets just bounce off. 2, railroads. Railroads were also pretty important as well. Railroads allow people to travel from one place to another place very quickly. So this allowed the Europeans, again, to set up a defensive position with the Maxim guns, and then they could quickly bring troops in to reinforce an area by railroads. So the railroads just allowed the Europeans to move their troops around very quickly, meaning they didn't have to have a ton of military troops in the area. They just had to have railroads going out to where they needed them to go out to, so they could easily move around troops to where they needed to be most. And the railroads helped out with that. And railroads also helped them to transport, stuff from the interior parts of Africa to the exterior parts for money purposes. Steamships, we talked about that before as well. So 3 steamships. Steamships were helpful because they allowed you to go upriver and you didn't have to worry about wind. So wind, not a problem. You can just go against the wind, doesn't matter because you got an engine that can move your boat. And we talked about steam before and how in the steam engine, it would turn turbine that would turn some water wheels that would move the ship. And finally, 4, cure for malaria. So cure for malaria, number 4. So they had kind of figured out vaccines. How they figured out vaccines wasn't originally with malaria. They had actually figured out a vaccine for smallpox. What happened was there was a doctor, and he was talking to some people, and he found out that some people had gotten another disease called cowpox, which was very similar to smallpox, but it was like a weaker variety, and people that got sick with cowpox, for some odd reason, they never then got smallpox. So they got cowpox, but no smallpox. And he was like, oh, okay, so if they get cowpox, and somehow that makes them immune then to smallpox. So to test out his theory, his idea, he asked his gardener, he's like, hey, gardener, is it okay if I inject you with like cowpox and then smallpox and we'll see if you live? And the gardener's like, no, but you can use my son. So he ends up using his gardener's son, does medical tests on him. So he injects the kid with smallpox, or cowpox, or injects the kid with cowpox, the weak form of smallpox. So he injects him with that. And then after a while, the kid gets the cowpox and so forth and develops some pulses on his bodies, but it's not like a whole bunch now like smallpox does. And then the kid's fine after a while. And he's like, okay, sweet. So the kid's totally fine now. So then he takes some smallpox, bam, injects it in the kid to see if the kid lived or not. Kid lived. He was totally fine. The smallpox didn't do anything once it was injected into his bloodstream. So that's how they figured out vaccines. You basically take a weak form of the virus, cowpox, and then you inject that into a person. They then get the symptoms of that weak form of the virus. And then the body learns, hey, if I ever see this thing again, I need to immediately kill it. So that way, so what happens then, they inject the smallpox in, your body's like, oh, hey, that stuff's evil. I know what that is, and immediately kills it. All right, so that's how vaccines work. It's a weak form of the virus injected in your body. So that way your body recognizes it and knows that it's evil and must be killed immediately. All right, that's it for today's notes.